The Imagining Transnational Solidarities Research Circle is pleased to announce the launch of a virtual talk series that grapples with the political tensions emerging at the intersections of multiple pandemics, COVID-19, anti-Black racism, casteism, and anti-Muslim violence, as well as the revolutionary possibilities and deep challenges that the present moment is revealing to us. Moved by the Black Lives Matter protests in the Twin Cities and elsewhere in the US and globally, we want to delve deeper into the new meanings of civic disobedience in the face of social distancing and the COVID-19 pandemic. We seek to explore embodied forms of theorizing that have emerged through protests that cross the limits of quarantines and curfews, to reframe racism as a centuries-old pandemic, no less deadly than the virus. The words of George Floyd and Eric Garner, "I can't breathe," have become a rallying cry connecting the Black struggle in the US to the struggles of people who are subjected to the violence of the empire. In the face of the increasing securitization, militarism, austerity measures, police violence, gender violence, fascism, anti-immigrant and anti-refugee nationalism, white supremacy, and settler colonial, neo-colonial, and imperialist practices around the world, struggles for justice from Palestine and Lebanon to Kashmir and the Balkans find common grounds with the Black Lives Movement in the US. At a time when environmental racism, sanctions, austerity measures, and the US made weaponry from tear gas to rubber bullets, chemical weapons, and drones, and the US financial and military support of authoritarian regimes make breathing impossible for populations that are deemed expendable under the logic of global capitalism and imperialism, as academics, artists, and activists based in the US, we find building situated transnational solidarities more pressing than ever before. Through activist, artistic, and academic modes of knowing, we search for new openings and political possibilities in different but connected geographical contexts. The recent global uprisings inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as by strong resistance movements in India, Kashmir, Palestine, Iraq, and Chile, to name a few places, offer new opportunities for building political solidarities that complicate notions of indigeneity, race, caste, religious strife, and citizenship transnationally. What might it mean to decenter the US modes of knowledge production by learning from the anti-kafala organizing and house rebuilding efforts in Lebanon, the protests against CAA and NRC in India, immigrant and refugee justice movements, global struggles against militarization and police violence, and the ongoing liberation movements in Palestine, in Kashmir, and around the world, while also embracing the lessons of grassroots movements such as Black Lives Matter and Standing Rock? We seek nuanced understandings and sharper political responses as we search for critical political solidarities across struggles, spaces, and identities. In collaboration with scholars, artists, activists, and other engaged members of the Twin Cities community, we hope to mobilize our intellectual and artistic creativity and our political analysis in ways that can powerfully address the dynamics that give rise to xenophobic, racist, casteist, and anti-Muslim violence. With this vision in mind, our webinars in July, August, September, and October of 2020 aim to engage, complicate, and decolonize political imaginations, currents, and alliances. These webinars will be spaces to nurture and advance the processes of building our convivial futures in a transnational world, where the value of life is differently assigned by multiple regimes of power that have historically relied on divide and conquer strategies in colonial modernity. How do we envision and form solidarities differently during the COVID-19 pandemic, when our pre-pandemic state of normalcy was defined by the routine killing of populations through mechanisms of global capitalism, the rise of fascism, imperialism, anti-Black racism, caste-based violence, class disparities, and Islamophobia? How do we mobilize and amplify voices for justice in times when restrictions on presence in physical spaces, as well as the greater use of virtual spaces for protests, have intensified the potential for surveillance? How do we build coalitional strategies and collective resistance that are proactive in the face of normalization of everyday violence, security regimes, as well as neoliberal coercions in academia, arts, and activism? What kinds of labors must we undertake as we reimagine, redefine, and reclaim our everyday spaces through such resistance? These are some of the questions that ground our webinars in the hopes of building ongoing conversations with our collaborators and visitors.
Welcome. Welcome to the webinar titled From Black Lives Matter in the US to Palestine, Kashmir, Iran, India, and the Balkans, Protest Strategies. The Imagining Transnational Solidarities Research Circle is pleased to host this event, gathering incredible speakers and a wide audience. Thank you for being with us today. We would like to take this opportunity to thank specific people and organizations for the work behind the scenes. To Richa Nagar and Sima Shakhsari, co-conveners of the ITSRC. To Samira Musleh, who read the ITSRC statement. To Sarah Musaifer and Nithya Rajan for chat moderation. To Jordan Lee Thompson for technical support. And to Caption Max for captioning. We would like to extend our gratitude to amazing co-hosts, Agitate, Mizna, Parak Minnesota, Femina, Yo Mama's House Cooperative, Quarantine Renaissance, Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, Stand With Kashmir, and Kashmir Scholars Consultative and Action Network. This webinar series is supported by the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change, ICGC, and Institute of Global Studies, IGS, of University of Minnesota, whom we would like to thank for their continued support, especially to colleagues Laura Bell and Keith Tucker. I am Emina Bujinkic, an activist from the Balkans, and I will be co-moderating this event in the capacity of the ITSRC's fellow and a PhD student at the University of Minnesota. The theme of this webinar intersects with my work committed to building solidarity movements with people on the move and refugees, strongly positioned against racial police violence and migration regimes or Fortress Europe. I am utterly pleased to co-moderate today's webinar with Lana Barkawi from Mizna, whom I would like to invite to introduce herself.
Thank you, Emina. Welcome, everybody. I'm Lana Barkawi. I'm the executive and artistic director of Mizna, which is an organization based in the US in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Mizna is an arts organization that serves as a critical platform for film, literature, and art, centering the work of Arab and other Southwest Asian and North African artists. I'm so honored to be here today with this powerful group of panelists. I'd like to give an overview for today's webinar and how it will be structured. We'll be together over the next couple of hours. We have an impressive group of powerful speakers, and excuse me, we'll be asking them 3 rounds of questions. We'll be introducing each speaker ahead of their response to the first round. In the first and third rounds, all panelists will be responding to the same question. The second round will involve more specific conversations about the struggles each speaker is immersed in. This event is live captioned for accessibility by Caption Max, and the link to the caption text is now being provided in the chat. The event is also live streamed in Facebook, and that link is also being provided in the chat. I welcome audiences to take a moment to spread the word about this special event to your followers on social media. The recording will also be available on the ITSRC Facebook page after the webinar. So to jump into our first round of questions and our introductions of our wonderful panelists, I'm pleased to open by introducing Noura Erakat. Oh, excuse me, I got ahead of myself. I'm going to actually describe the question and give the context and then introduce Noura, and that will lead us off. We come to today's webinar during the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and a time of deep reckoning with racism and state and police violence against Black, Brown, refugee, trans, Dalit, Native, Muslim, and other marginalized bodies. With this gathered group, we make powerful transnational connections to resistance movements in and for Palestine, Kashmir, India, Iran, and the Balkans. We are in a moment of urgency when we feel inspired and compelled not to let this momentum pass. We ask ourselves, what does it mean to be in conversation about solidarity movements beyond theorizing and surfaced analysis, while sharpening our political commitments to ongoing struggles for freedom? We're honored today to be with you 7 powerful activists and artists. Welcome. To begin our discussion, we'll introduce each of you, as I said, and ask that each of you share with us the struggles you're engaged with and the strategies of activism you turn to. And as this work can be difficult, traumatic, and dangerous, making us vulnerable to depletion, please also discuss how these struggles for freedom and the people who make them up can be sustained and nourished. So those will be the questions that will be the focus of our first round. And now I'm happy to welcome our first speaker, Noura Erakat. Noura Erakat is a human rights attorney and an assistant professor at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, in the Department of Africana Studies and the Program in Criminal Justice. Her research interests include humanitarian law, refugee law, national security law, and critical race theory. Noura is the author of Justice for Some, Law as Politics in the Question of Palestine. She's a co-founding editor of Jadaliyya, the Jadaliyya e-zine, and an editorial committee member of the Journal of Palestine Studies. She has served as legal counsel for a congressional subcommittee in the House of Representatives, as a legal advocate for the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Refugee and Residency Rights, and as a national grassroots organizer and legal advocate at the US campaign to end the Israeli occupation. Noura is co-editor of Aborted State, the UN Initiative and New Palestinian Junctures, an anthology related to the 2011 and 12 Palestine bids for statehood at the UN. More recently, Noura released a pedagogical project on the Gaza Strip and Palestine, which includes a short multimedia documentary, Gaza in Context, that rehabilitates Israel's wars on Gaza within a settler colonial framework. She's also the producer of the short video, Black Palestinian Solidarity. Noura, welcome. Please tell us about the struggles you're engaged with, the strategies of your activism, and also, as this work can be difficult, as I said, how movements for freedom can counter depletion in this difficult work.
Thank you, Lana, for that warm introduction, Amina, Richa, and Seema for organizing this powerful panel. Thank you to all the fellow panelists, which is, for me, in many instances, also an introduction and precisely part of the work of building the connections between us. So I have been engaged for about 2 decades and some change, advocacy for Palestinian liberation. And from the beginning of that work, it's always been framed within, even before there was language for it, but within an intersectional framework of understanding that the struggle for Palestinian liberation from within empire that sustains it, because I was doing this activism in the United States, is interconnected with systems of capitalist accumulation, deprivation, that's intimately connected to the military-industrial complex and the prison-industrial complex, and what Professor Asli Bali has come, to crystallized as the term of the military policing industrial complex, which connects very vividly and very clearly our experiences of how the US's imperial wars and expansion abroad are circulated back through the metropole, either through the distribution of excess military technologies, the exchange of carceral technologies, and then most importantly, the marking of racialized threats who are expendable, right? And who become the enemy within. And so part of that work, when we think about strategies and what that looks like, I'm just going to speak from a very personal place of, the biggest part of the struggle has been, what can we do? What is the way to be effective against these larger structures, right? So when you think especially when you're in the heart of empire, if you keep taking it to levels of abstraction, which we do as researchers, it's overwhelming because there's no way through to liberation without taking down capitalism and imperialism as its manifestation. And so we're, on the one hand of that, you can find yourself especially depleted, as you said, and especially demoralized that there's no way to win. On the other hand is to take inspiration that our present is a culmination of victories. And our ability to have overcome even more daunting challenges and circumstances, and then to commit ourselves to do what we have the capacity to do, to build. And so I've experimented with that idea as a student activist. When we launched divestment at UC Berkeley's campus in 2001, before it crystallized into the BDS international call in 2005. I then, part of my frustrations took me to law school because I thought legal advocacy was the way that we would take, we would just hold Israel to account with some fair arbiters and thereby hold the United States to account, and finding very much that the law is politics, which set me back to the academy and has produced the book that you all talked about, Justice for Some. And now I've continued to engage in knowledge production as a form of resistance, journalistic intervention as a form of resistance, and even cultural production. I'm one of the co-founders of the DC Palestinian Film and Arts Festival, which is right now running in its 10th year. So the idea that there really is no way to exhaust the things that we can do. What does that strategy look like? So when I think about, the big question for me is, we really are in a struggle against anti-imperialism, and even the contemporary articulation of Black Palestinian solidarity, which, suggests that there is transnational solidarity between two peoples. In my work and in my research, I found that what this iteration is, this contemporary iteration, is a reflection of a historic articulation of Black internationalism that found solidarity with the rest of the world in revolt against an imperial world order. Right. And in the present articulation, so much of that has faded because of the former colonies have by and large become independent, with significant exceptions, including Palestine and including, ongoing occupations as in Kashmir. And so what then does anti-imperial resistance look like now without national armed liberation movements, without a world upheaval, without being able to establish an automatic majority at the UN General Assembly that can subvert US hegemony, right? And to answer that question, I'll just end here, which is, I found that the answer to that question is really in our local organizing, that we take these big questions and what does it look like localized? It's the same way I think about abolition. Abolition is huge, but on a local level, it means taking the cops out of schools. It means slashing municipal funding for police on the local level. It means transfer, it's budget work, it's policy work. And so same thing when we're thinking about the localization of anti-imperialism, it's what does, joint campaigns against G4S, which is both operative, it's a security surveillance system that both, is part of the infrastructure of the war on terror. It's part of the infrastructure of Israeli prisons, and it's part of the infrastructure of US prisons. So that's one campaign where even the localized targeting of G4S becomes a manifestation and an articulation of anti-imperialism in our present. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Nora. Amoke Kubat is our next speaker, and she is a multidisciplinary artist, a social weaver, and an activist. At 70, she remains curious about self, the natural world, and the sacred. Self-taught, she uses art making and writing to continue to define herself and hold a position of wellness in an America sick with inequalities and inequities. For 35 years, she has been reclaiming an African indigenous spiritual sensibility. Amoke imagined and created Yo Mama's Art of Mothering workshop. This art-based practice of wellness began as a drop-in art space for mothers who are artists, social justice activists, and healers. Yo Mama's philosophy and practice are to empower mothers by disrupting the devaluation of women's visible and invisible labor and increasing the recognition of the art of mothering that highlights the legacies of cultural maternal wisdom and know-how that sustains healthy mothers, families, and communities. Yo Mama's House is a demonstration project and model that many can learn from its mother-centered, social gospel, and grassroots approach to empowering women as mothers to do their mothering work and creating pathways to wellness for those overburdened, under-resourced, and sick and tired of being sick and tired. Amoke believes that healthy mothers raise healthy children, families, and communities. Amoke, please welcome to offer your response.
Good morning. Oh, boy, thank you for the first speaker. That was wonderful. To add to that, I think I look at the word struggle. I look at how that language is often a tool of oppression that's not looked at. So I have discarded struggle. I say striving. I'm in the stride. I'm in the striving in this liberation practice. Black people have long not been breathing since we've been in the United States. Mothers have long not been breathing. Mothers' bodies have been focal points and have been considered disruptions, distractions, and discardable. So I look at my work as how do I link the history to the hope, to the imagination, to the spirituality to keep us going. I refuse to be in a struggle. I'm in the striving. I teach women to look at their histories and their legacies and their languaging. I teach us to look at how do we look at internalized oppression, because that often does not get to the table of what we have had to suck up and keep in and still keep going. Remind me of your question again. I just lost my train of thought there.
Can you introduce us to the struggles or to the striving you are immersed in? And
I'm immersed in. I'm part of a beautiful community here in Northside Minneapolis, and I am, and it's all of us. It's children, it's youth, it's 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 somethings, and even older. And we have a shared collective knowledge base. We don't have to go to a dead book of some knowledge written by an anthropologist. We have living legacies. We have walking libraries. We have people that we can go to and say, how did you get this done? We see people getting things done, getting the impossible to do. So how do we continue to connect and say that? I say we don't do the 911 anymore. We do the 411. We keep advocating for what is the information, what do we need, and we know it's not a static answer, it's not a one answer, it's not a one size fit all answer. So the striving is continuing to pull our spiritual legacy and our cultural legacies and what we have contributed and what we need to have done. So that's what I basically I'm doing all the time. I also kind of do the brushing off and the kissing and the hugging and the picking up, even kind of virtually, to keep us going, because we're a hugging, kissing, joyful people despite all of it.
Thank you, Amoke. That was beautiful. I'm pleased to introduce Jay Yates. Jay is a recent graduate from the University of Minnesota, whose academic interests include gender and technology, medical racism, and folk medicine in enslaved and indigenous communities during the antebellum period. During the uprising here in Minneapolis this summer, Jay and several friends have become attached to multiple mutual aid sites, using grassroots fundraising to get food, first aid supplies, and hygiene products to approximately 100 people per day. Currently, they work with Community Aid Network Minnesota, a conglomerate of multiple pop-up aid sites that seek to continue mutual aid efforts as the pandemic continues. Jay also played a small role in organizing the Taking Back Pride protest with Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar, a queer-led anti-police organization that has protested corporate presence and police participation in pride events in the Twin Cities for several years. Recently, Jay has been assisting with protest planning, trainings, and legislation for community control of the police as TCC4J continues their work. In a continued partnership with the Minnesota Youth Story Squad, Jay and a group of fellow U of M alumni and graduate students are also documenting the youth experience of the uprising, as well as discussing gentrification in South Minneapolis and anti-LGBTQ sentiment in movement spaces. Welcome, Jay. Happy to have you with us, and looking forward to your responses to the question.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this. It's really amazing to be around such like prolific speakers and activists. Yeah, the struggles that I'm engaged with are myriad, as you could tell from my bio. I think that activism for me has really sort of been like this, not accidental, but like something that has kind of evolved very organically for me. I started like, way back in late May and June, just going around with some friends of mine, and just really trying to see like what we could do as like 20 somethings, like what we could possibly have to like offer to this situation, and what skills do we have to try and build community in this moment. And I think that that's really what activism is to me. It's just sort of looking and evaluating what you have to bring, and recognizing that everyone has something that they can do. Like I think that we have to start asking ourselves like what practically we can do in this moment, because I guess as an academic and someone who's trained in academia, it's really easy, as Noura was saying, to like get caught up in the hugeness of like these issues that we're facing of, like how are we supposed to take on the entire United States government when like we're not armed, we're like, a bunch of disparate communities all living in the same place, but with sometimes disparate goals and disparate understandings of what the movement is. And so like how can we sort of get past the big picture before it like propels us into inaction, I guess, is something that I've been thinking about a lot. I think as far as countering depletion and sustaining oneself, I think that that's been difficult for me personally, but I think that it's gotten like easier as the months have gone on, because like I feel that I've started building all of these different solidarities with different groups of people, and so I guess I just feel a lot more connected than I did at the beginning of this, and I think that that's so critical to like continuing to sustain yourself, because I think that especially right now when we're sort of having to isolate ourselves out of necessity, I think that it's easy to forget that isolation is also harmful, that we can't exist completely apart from each other. And so I think that I have been trying to build connections more intentionally than maybe I was doing in the past, which I guess is something that's good about one good thing about this current movement. And I think the other thing is really education to me. I think that it's been really apparent that some people in the movement right now are either newer or coming from different positionalities. And so, like, how do we create solidarity between groups of people that maybe don't know a lot about each other, either historically or just in general? I think that there's a lot of coalition building has to happen through teaching people, because there's no guarantee of where everyone is coming from, and that's okay. But in order to build like a real functional movement that's based in solidarity with places like Palestine, people have to know what has been going on in Palestine, for example. And in the US, that's just not a knowledge base that a lot of people have, even people like myself that have, gone through college and, learned about some of the aspects of that. I think that, the US system is just really steeped in that American exceptionalism. And so we just don't learn about other places and like learn about other tactics and learn about, how is your struggle on the other side of the world related to my liberation, and how can I be a tool to your liberation? Because, frankly, we outnumber our oppressors. And the only way for us to overthrow them is to consolidate that power.
Thank you, Jay, for your powerful voice. I'm honored to introduce Ather Zia, a political anthropologist, poet, short fiction writer, and a columnist. She teaches at the University of Northern Colorado, Greeley. Ather is the author of Resisting Disappearances, Military Occupation and Women's Activism in Kashmir, and co-editor of Can You Hear Kashmiri Women Speak? Resisting Occupation in Kashmir, and A Desolation Called Peace. She has published a poetry collection, The Frame, and another collection is forthcoming. Ather's ethnographic poetry on Kashmir has won an award from the Society for Humanistic Anthropology. She is the founder editor of Kashmir Lit and is the co-founder of Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, an interdisciplinary network of scholars working on the Kashmir region. Ather, please share with us the struggles you are engaged with and the strategies of activism you turn to.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Amina. Thank you, Seema, and thank you, Richa, for putting this together and all the technological support. And thanks to my panelists. I'm really happy and honored to be here. You're asking about nourishment. I feel like this is nourishing in and of itself. I have 5 minutes to speak, so I'm going to quickly consolidate what I have to say. The struggle that I'm engaged with, I think at the current moment, what we are doing is we're in a very nascent phase of trying to make the world understand what the situation is, what Kashmir is about. Because one of the things that is being permeated by the Indian government in the international media and through different narratives that they have created is that Kashmir is an issue that connects directly to the problem of what is quote unquote the global terrorism. So I think that's the clutches that we have to kind of like make it come out of, the clutches of thinking about it in the rubric of terrorism. And also, so that's one of the most important parts of what we're trying to do. And one of the engagements that I have with the struggle is trying to do public facing scholarship, trying to create these niches for critical Kashmir studies, the nuanced way of looking at Kashmir, and trying to bring it to international attention, and not just as a territorial or a border dispute between India and Pakistan, but as a Kashmiri dispute, as a question from Kashmiri vantage, from the vantage of Kashmiri people, how they have seen it for the last 72 years, and also trying to excavate it, not just from 1947, but also before 1947, what was happening inside Kashmir. So I think we are in this phase where we are, internationally speaking, for the last 72 years, India has been really, really successful in trying to tell the rest of the world that this is a law and order situation, that this is a proxy war from Pakistan, and from 2001 onwards, that it is terrorism. And that's how Kashmiri fighters, the armed struggle, is referred to. And I think by extension, anyone speaking for Kashmiri struggle, anyone speaking for the resistance movement, they are made quote unquote terrorists by extension. People like me, they're called, in 2017, there was an article which kind of like was manifesting what the government policy in India is. People who are researching about Kashmir, writing about Kashmir, they were called intellectual terrorists. So that's the level of obfuscation that is prevailing upon what the Kashmiri situation is. And that's where people like me and people who are striving for this at the moment is excavating Kashmiri situation for the international audiences, for the international community, and trying to tell them that this is not just a black and white problem. This is a problem of the Kashmiri people. And for lack of a better analogy, many times Kashmir is connected to Palestine, and Kashmiris do that deliberately. There are several things that are important in that to understand, not just brush it off that this probably is not the best analogy or it shouldn't be done. But I think what the Kashmiri people, when they invoke Gaza, when they invoke Palestine, you will see these slogans all over Kashmir: free Palestine, free Gaza, and kind of like, Friday afternoons, the Friday prayers are usually devoted to praying for Palestine as well. And I think that's invoking that Kashmir is one of the oldest disputes on the United Nations agenda, side by side with Palestine. This has been going on for the last 72 years or more. And also trying to say that this is not the terrorism issue. This is not what India is trying to tell you. It's not a law and order situation. It's not India's internal problem, but it's a problem that has three faces. Of course, there's Pakistan, there is India, that have to talk about the remnants and the post-colonial legacies that the British have left behind. But this is primarily an issue of Kashmiris, and it is a genuine resistance struggle. And I think that's what we are at the moment engaged in, trying to do that. And I think, my personal viewpoint and my personal vantage is from academia, because as Noura was earlier referring to, there's cultural, there's political side. And when you think about law, when you think about producing knowledge, it comes back to academia. And then of course, when you are in academia, then you think about, it comes from politics. So all of this is interrelated. But for Kashmiris, you will see a generation of people moving back to academia and trying to think about things that have been culturally banned on us for the last 72 years, because Kashmiris, they don't know their own history. We read World War history, we read World War II, we read about Western struggles, we read about Indian struggles, but Kashmiris don't know much of their own history. It's been everyone's personal struggle to kind of go back and see what's been happening to us. And I think that's the mode that we are in. We are laying the foundation of that kind of knowledge from Kashmiri vantage. And I think it's very important for the coming generations and the solidarities that we are trying to build. And thinking about the solidarities, that's another thing that Kashmiris, from their vantage, from their the niche that they are trying to carve, that they're trying to build, seeing how they're so interrelated. When very recently, when there was an uprising in Chile, what happened was that you had these images of people with shotgun pellet injuries in their eyes, and that is so telling. That the other part of this is that there was this, the images that were being proliferated on media about the blindings that were happening inside Kashmir, that have been happening since 2008, increasingly because of the shotgun pellets being used. There was this interchanging of a picture. There was a Palestinian girl whose picture was being used as a Kashmiri girl. So of course that was an error, but the wisdom in the error was that these images are all reflecting each other. So we have to, this is a moment that we have to take and start thinking about, why are these images proliferating and why are they so similar? What is the similarity here? And going back to thinking about anti-imperial struggles and trying to think about the kind of, money making that is being done, and the way these struggles may look different, but they are same against imperialism, and they are struggle against rampant neoliberalism. And I think those are things that we have to keep in mind that should be bonding us together, and that of course, and that bonding and that also is very nourishing personally to me. But at the same time, I think about what nourishes Kashmiri people at the moment, especially what's been happening to them, not just in the last 72 years, but since 33 years, and not just 33 years, but since August 5th, 2019, last year. What nourishes them? And at the moment, the kind of repression that they're facing, it's very hard to think about personal nourishment when the people are repressed, when they're under double lockdown, when they are undergoing the Indian repression and Indian occupation relentlessly. So it's very hard to think about, that. But at the same time, I am very hopeful that we are at a moment where people are interested in this struggle, where we haven't internationalized it. Kashmir hasn't been internationalized. It's been re-internationalized in the last few years, and especially the last 1 year. So I think that's where I am at currently in my personal struggle, as well as the collective struggle that Kashmiri people are facing.
Thank you, Athar. You've given us so much to think about it. Thank you for sharing your struggle and your thoughts. I'm happy now to introduce Susan Tahmasabi. Susan has been working to strengthen civil society and advocate women's rights in Iran and in the MENA region for over 20 years. Currently, she serves as the executive director of Femina, an organization working to support women human rights defenders, their organization, and their movements in the broader MENA region. Femina is particularly focused on contexts of shrinking and restricted civil society space. Between 1999 and 2010, Tahmasabi was based in Iran, where she co-founded the Iran Civil Society Training and Research Center, focused on strengthening the capacity of Iranian civil society. She was also a founding member of the 1 Million Signatures campaign, a grassroots effort working to end gender-biased laws in Iran. Tahmasabi's expertise includes movement building in contexts of shrinking civic space, reform of women's rights in Muslim societies, civil society capacity building, and women's peace and security in MENA region, among other issues. Tahmasabi is Iranian and American by birth and is fluent in both English and Farsi. She resides in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Susan. Thank you for being with us. And we're looking forward to your responses to the questions.
Thank you very much for hosting this very important discussion. Thank you to all the organizers, and I'm very honored to be among both the organizers and this distinguished panel. So my struggle really at present is on two levels. One is working in the MENA region, and actually the broader MENA region, something closer to the SWANA that you described. So it's similar in what you're working on, and then also in Iran. And I'll start from a sort of not such a distant history, but a closer history of about 10 years ago, when we were witness to the emergence of the Arab revolutions in the MENA region. And people were, surprised that the people from this region were demanding rights. And, but for those of us who've worked in this region, it was really no surprise, because people have been struggling for democracy in this region for over 100 years. So, and at the forefront of these revolutions, we saw movements, especially women's movements, but many other movements. But I'll talk about women because this is sort of my expertise and my interests, that were progressive, that were intersectional in their approaches, that demanded not only rights and democracy, but were speaking out against imperialism, about the security systems that govern the entire region. So they were really criticizing multiple issues, and they had multiple demands. Unfortunately, the majority of these movements didn't achieve what they set out to achieve. I don't want to say that the countries and regions are worse off, because I think that all of them have learned something from this experience, but many of them sort of spiraled down into conflict, or we have more authoritarian regimes in some of these countries. And I think what happened in the MENA region is, after both the dictators in the region and the international community seeing the emergence of these movements and what resulted from them, they've taken a much more securitized approach to the region. So, justified under the pretense of, fighting terrorism, fighting extremism. And I think, and they've become much more authoritarian. So the struggle that I'm engaged in the broader MENA region is to sort of bring attention to the fact that there are very progressive movements that have been sidelined in this fight against extremism, for example, where partners of the international community has become some of these more regressive groups that are speaking about peace and against extremism, but they don't necessarily believe in rights, and they don't necessarily believe in contesting or challenging the existing political orders in the region. And so our struggle is to really center the voices of movement activists, particularly women's movement activists, in the debates in the region and internationally, and strengthen them so that they can advocate locally as well. And to prove and show and remind the international community that, yes, there are very progressive movements in the region, and we need to engage them and stand in solidarity with them. So that's regionally. But in Iran, I think my struggle is similar in that, again, it is intended to center the voices of women human rights defenders, the feminist movement inside the country. And in Iran particularly, the Iranian women's movement has been so incredibly isolated and sidelined, not only because of repressive government policies, they are extremely repressive, but also because of the international policies, and in particular sanctions that prevent the participation of movement activists inside the country in forums where women's issues are being discussed, where Iranian women's issues are being discussed, where issues of the region are being discussed. They are completely and utterly absent. So it's reminding and trying to center both their perspective and their issues, and supporting them to do that. And I think in terms of feeling depleted, the entire region, I think, feels very, very depleted, certainly after those very successful, and now we have them again, but I think they're very violent now. So the protests and revolts that they had, and that sense of hopelessness that emerged once they couldn't necessarily achieve what they were looking to achieve. So you have this incredible sense of depletion and frustration, and in an environment that's securitized, and civil society and movements are repressed and criminalized, it becomes even a greater challenge. I think we've had a few instances, for example, Sarah Higazi, the Egyptian activist who committed suicide in Canada, and we've had several of similar examples in the Iranian context. It brings attention to the need to really focus on providing psychosocial support and supporting women who are at the front lines of these struggles, because not only are they fighting at the sort of the community and cultural level against patriarchal norms that sort of tell them, that subject them to violence, but also tell them that it's not their business, they should be staying home. But they're also going up against these political structures that don't want their engagement, and they don't want their involvement. And so they're suffering greatly. One thing that we're doing, and it's very, I was glad that Nora said going back to the local. This is a very small effort, but I think it's a very critical effort that we're doing at Femina. And other groups have been doing it for a long time. We haven't had, I don't think we've had it enough in the MENA region, is to bring attention to issues about wellness of women human rights defenders, the need for psychosocial support for them, and the need for them and their movements to pay attention to psychological and emotional and physical well-being of people who are engaged at the front lines on these very critical and important and difficult issues. So this is kind of what we're working on and providing training to activists in the region to do. We have this sense of, I think, especially in all contexts, but in the MENA region especially, I think that that we have to work. Activism is a selfless act, and you work till you die, right? But we're trying to reframe those discussions and those understandings to say that this is a long struggle. We need to remain in this struggle. It's critical that we remain in this struggle. How do we remain in this struggle for the long time so that we can bring about change? And the way that we can do it is that we care about our own health, our own well-being, and we support each other, both to be healthy and to be well, but also to be safe from security pressures and backlash. So that's kind of what we're doing. And of course, I myself am trying to do that as well. It's difficult. I'm privileged that I'm not in the same context. I'm not at the front lines at this point, but that also creates a lot of psychological pressure as well. But I'm trying to adhere to those recommendations that we're giving to our partners on the ground.
Thank you, Susan, for this salient contribution coming from Iranian and then transnational context too. It's a really true pleasure to welcome Mira Sangamitra to this webinar as well. Mira is an independent human rights activist that has been associated for more than a decade with the National Alliance of People's Movements, a pan-Indian collective of mass movements of Adivasis, Dalits, farmers, workers, fisher people, and other marginalized communities. She has also been active in the struggle of the Narmada Dam Outseas. She's presently one of the national conveners of NAPM, as well as convener of NAPM Telangana. She's also an active member of many women's rights and transgender movements and initiatives at the state and national levels. Trained as a lawyer, she has had an abiding interest in human rights, environmental and social justice issues since college years, when, along with a few like-minded friends, she co-founded a small group called Grassroots and got associated with different collectives and campaigns in then united Andhra Pradesh. Between March 2008 and June 2016, she has been associated and traveling with activist Medha Patkar and was involved full-time with the Narmada Bachao Andolan in understanding and engaging on an everyday basis with the democratic struggle of thousands of Outseas for decentralized development, right to land, livelihood, rehabilitation, environmental justice, touching at multiple levels the interface of the people, state, and society. She serves on the governing board of pro-people organizations like the Humsafar, Support Center for Women, Bindrai Institute for Research, Study, and Action, and is also associated with other alliances, including campaigns for judicial accountability, right to education, women's and transgender rights, and social justice. She is a member of the Telangana Hijra Intersex Transgender Samiti, National Transgender People's Movements, Women Against Sexual Violence and State Repression, and the Women and Transgender Organizations Joint Action Committee. Welcome, Mira. Please introduce us to the struggles you are immersed in and the strategies of activism you turn and utilize.
Thank you, Amina. Thanks to all the organizers of this absolutely amazing panel. And I think thanks to each of the panelists, I've literally been taking notes because there have been very, very significant inputs that one has heard so far from all of you. So absolutely floored by the way the panel has been put together. I would want to start off, in fact, the moment that we are in right now in India is in some way similar to the I can't breathe moment in the United States. We are seeing a massive uprising amidst the pandemic in the context of multiple attacks on Dalit women in particular. Some of the most marginalized people who have been subjected to brutal gang rapes and murders, and in the context of fascist state literally ruling over us. So I think the uprising that we are seeing right now across the country is remarkable, and we must take a moment to acknowledge the struggle of Dalit women who've literally seen centuries of oppression and continue to stand up for their rights. And it's also important, I think, to acknowledge that slowly there is an increasing sense of solidarity that we see, although one would still say it's not as significant probably, and friends in the United States would obviously not be happy, because it's much more needed that, you need many more white folks and non-Black folks to stand in solidarity. Same with India. We have a long way to go, but it is significant that I think more and more people are realizing the importance of standing up for the struggles of the other marginalized communities. And I would, in fact, start from there. Patriarchy as something so central to all our struggles, whether it is our struggle against toxic extractive development models, whether it is a struggle against capitalism, whether it is against oppressive religions. Patriarchy is somewhere central to a lot of our struggles, and even our struggle against the fascism that India is facing today, and the complete clampdown on people's basic rights to speak and assert themselves and be themselves. Therefore, I think this whole struggle against patriarchy is, it's of course, this has always been the cry of the feminist movements, of the struggle against patriarchy being not just a political struggle, but also a deeply personal struggle. And for me, as a transgender woman who was located for a very long time, for more than a decade, in an anti-displacement struggle, it was a continuing challenge, but also an opportunity to connect this personal and political struggle with the struggles of the other marginalized peoples who are facing the oppression of destructive development model. Although I think even within movements, there is always this challenge that you are boxed and you are expected to perform or respond to certain, perform certain forms of solidarities. I think one has always made an attempt to break some of those boundaries, question some of those boxes, and assert the need for solidarity across identities, solidarities across our individual experiences of oppression. So I think it was, so as much as one in fact learned significantly and engaged significantly in the struggle with farmers and workers as part of an anti-displacement struggle in the Narmada Valley, and also got the opportunity to be part of a collective social journey of what it means to be a transgender person within a broader political movement. I think one also felt that it is important to speak of solidarities in much more, not just speak, but in fact perform solidarity work in more broader ways. And that was how I think my own journey as well, political journey, progressed to engaging with other questions of and connecting with other questions of feminist struggles, the struggles of political prisoners and those who are facing repression in India, and other struggles of civil liberties. Strategies, I just thought I should mention one thing at this point. Often political solidarity is seen as a strategy, but I think it's important to state here that political solidarity shouldn't necessarily be seen as strategy, but as a value in itself. And only when we value solidarity as indispensable to all of our struggles, to our collective liberation, can we invest in it in that way. So therefore, I think as part of our struggles as well in NAPM or in other processes, we look at solidarity, and we understand that there is a lot of solidarity is not just this one-time visible action. Solidarity is this everydayness. There is this mundaneness to solidarity, but which is so significant, and therein lies the beauty of solidarity. It is not an occasional act of togetherness. It is this everydayness that one really needs to tend to. And I think that actually brings a lot of strength to our collective movements as well. When we stand in solidarity continuously, when we respond in time to other people's struggles, I think that also increases, that broadens the horizon for solidarity that you receive in your own struggles. So So yeah, that has also been, it has not been an easy journey, but I think that is a path that we must continue to take collectively, to invest in solidarity as a continuing and literally a full-time process of engagement. And speaking of exhaustion, yes, it of course is, but I think it's really important to continue to have these kinds of conversations and look at struggles that that have been hugely inspiring. So again, a lot of times, I mean, we as activists or people in movements continue to face this question as to whether we really are emerging, quote unquote, victorious vis-a-vis the huge powers that be. But again, victory is not this one big thing, or revolution is not this one big thing that would, or liberation is not this one big thing that would happen immediately or that is always tangible. We see change in so many different ways, and I think that is nourishing. That that possibilities that we see constantly within our movements. So it is a continuing process of pushback. And we see that through political education, we certainly are able to reach out to a lot more people who over time do understand and engage with many of our struggles. So it's important, much as one thinks that you shouldn't compromise on many of our fundamentals in terms of political clarity and political commitment. It's also important, I mean, it has been a learning as part of a political experience to not, and I would completely agree with Jay over there, that it's important, probably, I'll just take it one step forward and say that it's important to not write people off, especially in fascist times when we are dealing with such oppressive regimes. It's important to reach out and engage at the same time without compromising on our core values. It is a tough battle, but I think we've been trying to push some of these boundaries, and we will continue to do so.
Thank you, Mira, for sharing your wisdom. Appreciate you. It's now my pleasure to introduce Selma Banich. Selma is an artist and precarious cultural worker born in Yugoslavia and living in Zagreb. Her artistic and social practice is based on processual research and activist work and is politically inspired by anarchism and feminism. Selma has worked independently and in collaboration with other artists, curators, groups, and initiatives in the Balkans, across Europe, and in the US, at the intersection of art and activism from below. Her performances, actions, and interventions in public space and engaged practices in communities critically examine the role and emancipatory potential of cultural work in the wider social context, with a strong interest in holistic and intersectional practices aiming to dismantle all forms of domination and social hierarchy. She participates in local and transnational solidarity initiatives related to the ongoing feminist, anti-fascist, migrant, and worker struggles. Currently, those initiatives are Trans-Balkan Solidarity, Women to Women Trans-Migrant Collective, and For Bread, Cultural Workers Rising Up for Wages. Welcome, Selma. Thank you for being with us.
Hello from Zagreb. I'm so honored to be a part of this webinar. I'm listening. I'm just listening, and I'm so grateful to this amazing opportunity to learn and to be with and to think with you all. I would like to express also my deep gratitude for the space, for my voice in this inspiring composition of activists, artists, and scholars. So I truly feel welcomed. Thank you. So I wanted just to shortly introduce myself as a freelance artist. I have been challenged by the precarious systemic conditions for labor in culture and have been engaged in counteracting those conditions for now almost 2 long decades. So I am speaking from a position of an artist that can barely make a living from her work in the market-oriented cultural production in Europe and beyond. But I'm here today with a wish to share my experience as an artist and activist that stands in solidarity with people on the move, people that migrate to and through Europe seeking refugehood. So with the people that are on the forefront of the struggle for freedom of movement and the unconditional right to stay and settle. So I believe that persistent movements across borders, right, that are caused by various forms of systemic violence, social and environmental injustice, and socioeconomic inequity, do not only contain strategies for survival, right? The ongoing struggles of people on the move also disrupt technologies of confinement, subverting the conditions of oppression and challenging our universal understanding of freedom. So I understand and experience the migration justice movement as a liberation movement, one that challenges the rule of the states, its laws, rules, and policies, that challenges the concept of the state, that challenges the concept of citizenship, that challenges state and corporate domination and social hierarchy. And not only for people on the move, right? People with a migrant refuge or asylum seeking experience, but also for everyone else, for myself included, of course. For me personally, the encounters with people on the move, people that I encounter on the Balkan route, through the Balkan route, are a constant reminder of how every dangerous, life-threatening journey they take, every act of systemic violence that is being funded and that is being funded and that is being produced by the state, the nation state, and the European Union as such, by every violation of human dignity endured by so many is in fact endured also for my own personal and political freedoms. And in other words, I believe that, and we see it, we see it constantly, with every boat deporting, we see it, and with every plane deporting, with every violent pushback that is happening daily, detention, incarceration, torture testimony. We are in a way, or I feel that I'm called to join that movement and its uprising. And people on the move, their daily struggles and the solidarity movements with the people on the move and their daily struggles are sending a message, a powerful message to the rulers. And this is why I find it, and I want to speak about it in this composition, this panel, that is, you cannot rule what is ungovernable. They are asking these questions. That is, no nation state, government, military power, economy, or political regime has the right to decree on one life being valuable and another dispensable. And that is, no one can prescribe whom I or you or we can care or cannot care for. These are basically, I would say, why I find it at this point in my life where I am fundamentally, what is fundamentally why I'm part of this solidarity movement with the people that I meet daily, that I encounter daily, that I'm in a way related to 24/7 daily without being able to, kind of move away in any way. So I'm saying that their struggle is, it is infecting, it is becoming my struggle through time since 2015 for me personally. And in that sense, I see the current work of Trans-Balkan Solidarity and other solidarity initiatives with the people on the move as one seeking and building a stronger local and transnational connection between the feminist, LGBTIQ, migrant and artistic communities in the Balkans. So I see this is where we are at this moment. And on the other hand, on that line, as an artist, I'm interested to understand how art as a practice and as a cultural production can be utilized as a tool for social change. How can a practice on the intersection of art and activism can support the ongoing struggles and starving for freedom and liberation. And in that process, I have experienced solidarity, listening, embodiment, clandestine practice, direct action, sharing resources, mutual care, mutual aid, holistic healing, and trust, amongst many others, as fierce tools, that are, as another panelist was saying, are not, we cannot talk about strategies. We have to talk about values, definitely. So I think this is, yeah, thank you. This is for the first round. I feel fine to share that for now.
Thank you, Selma, a true comrade of mine. And thank you all for these compelling introductions, provoking many thoughts, feelings, and a really intellectual humility. We will turn now to the second round of questions in which we grapple with hierarchies and tensions within and between solidarity movements. And we will start with Jay. Jay, could you please speak about the ways in which the current Black Lives Matter movement in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder by the police might be different from the protests in 2014? For instance, what kind of generational differences you might be noticing, and what opportunities and challenges do those pose? How have BIPOC, queer, and trans youth participated in the protests, and what insights they have offered to the movement? Do you see connections with the other liberation struggles in this regard? The BLM movement has surged in powerful ways across the US and beyond, with the acknowledgement of the systemic nature of racism being understood in a much more mainstream way than ever before. And given that the stakes are so high for the Black community in the US, thinking, for example, about the politicizing of Black bodies protesting in the streets, can you reflect on the implications of the movement gathering a much broader, perhaps much wider base?
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there. But to start, I think that, I can't necessarily speak about 2014 because I moved here in 2015, I think. But I was here for the Philando Castile protests in 2016. And I think that, comparing that to this has been really interesting, because I think that like the response for Philando Castile was, similar in size, maybe, as far as like, number of people coming out to like the first few protests, but it wasn't sustained. I feel like it really kind of, in a sense, died once the verdict came down. Whereas now it sort of doesn't feel like that's what's going to happen in Minnesota with either verdict that comes down in regards to Chauvin and the other accomplices in the murder of George Floyd. I think that there's a feeling of more sustained action, which I think it's disingenuous to say that that's, that no activists at the time were like thinking about sustained action when Philando Castile was killed. I mean, TCC for J had been obviously doing work before that, but I think that there's more momentum, and I think that momentum has attracted a lot of different positionalities to the movement in a way that maybe they weren't involved before, and that includes myself. Like I said, I've been involved in protesting, but haven't been organizing myself before now. It's sort of the difference between like, showing up to the barbecue and just like, hanging out versus like actually having to like put in the planning and like make a dish and bring it. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of younger people that have been galvanized in this moment, which is really inspiring to see. And I think a lot of them are really making an effort to be sort of educated in what intersectionality means in this moment, and trying to think about how, how does like my experience with SROs in schools, for example, relate to this wider problem of police brutality, and like how does advocating for this smaller issue relate to a larger struggle. And I think that they're really aware of that, which is really amazing, and very thoughtful about that. But as to the challenges of that, I think that there are a lot of people that, as I said earlier, are coming from different knowledge bases, which can be really problematic when you are trying to organize around specific principles of basic solidarity with other groups. There's been a lot of LGBTQ violence and just general kind of like disrespect publicly, and it's really difficult to know like where everyone is sort of coming from, and therefore like how to meet them, I guess, in the moment. One example that I can think of is, right after George Floyd was murdered, there was an incident where a young trans woman here got mobbed by like 40 Black men who were attacking her and threatening harm to her, and like apparently thought of themselves as part of the movement. And it's like, well, how is that possible for you to be part of the movement when you're talking about protecting Black lives, but that's conditional, just like it is for like white supremacists and the police? Like, that's not, you are not involved in the same struggle. And it's like, how do we like educate people, but also recognize at what point education is maybe no longer the goal, that like the goal is protecting those people that are being attacked. And I think that it's been a really difficult line to ride, especially now being more like part of an organization. Like you don't want to have like this big like public dispute necessarily, because that's only a tool for white supremacists and for right-wing media to use against us, really, and paint us as like this divided front. But also, we're not a cult, and so like there's a lot of different understandings of what we're trying to do within the movement. It's like, how do we unify that while also protecting people and understanding that you can't have a welcoming space that welcomes everyone, and that at a certain point, like there have to be hard lines drawn of, we are not going to accept misogyny and transphobia in our movement. We just simply, like, you are not going to organize with us. So yeah, to that point, I think queer and trans youth have really kind of brought that into perspective for me in particular, just because they have such an energy of like, we're not today, like they're very energetic, and I think that a lot of them really know what they want. And so
Jay, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I really appreciate these powerful ideas and questions you're raising, but just in the interest of time, I'll just ask you to wrap up.
Definitely. Yeah, the last thing that I'll just say is that I think that we are kind of all having to grapple with having youth in the movement, and also with having more white people in the movement, which, like I said earlier, just means that everyone is sort of coming from different angles, and how to unify those into something coherent and like actually actionable.
Thank you so much, Jay, for giving us so much to think about. I'm happy to turn now to Ather, and I will be asking you a number of questions that you can respond to as you like. Ather, the boundary-defying roles you play as an academic, a journalist, an activist, and a poet seem to have resonance in bringing multifaceted responses to the question of solidarities. Why do we need to create solidarities, and how do we envision them? What does it mean for you to speak about solidarity 72 years after Kashmiri occupation, forced disappearances, and killings by the Indian Army? How can one stand with Kashmir, uphold politically meaningful diasporic solidarity, and maintain an accountable political commitment to the liberation of Kashmiri people in Kashmir? What threats does the Kashmiri liberation movement face, and how do the gender politics and appropriation of women's struggles essentialize solidarities? There's a lot there, but welcome you to discuss.
Thank you so much, Lana, for this question. There's several ways to answer it, and there's so many questions here that it's hard to choose which one I want to go with first. But I think I would really like to speak to the idea of solidarity. As Mira earlier said, that solidarity is not a strategy, but it's a principle, it's a value, it's an ethos. And it's something that none of us can do without. Why after 72 years? Why are we seeking solidarity? I think that's why we are seeking solidarity, because for the last 72 years, no one has really known what the Kashmiri vantage is, because there have been no people willing to lend hand, not because they don't want to, that's because they don't know anything about Kashmir. And I think this is the moment, and I think Noura earlier articulated this, that this is the moment, and most of you did. I think this is the moment, like, how do we see our struggle right now? Should we see that Kashmir as a state that it existed before August 5th, 2019, that it's been erased and they repressed these people, and should we see it as that, or should we see this as a beginning of something that is going to grow and grow bigger? And I think I belong to the camp where I see what has happened in the past 72 years, then from 1989 onwards, 33, 34 years, and from August 5th, 2019, I see these are different junctures that are kind of building towards the kind of knowledge base that has already been created, and that's where other people in other parts of the globe, they factor into this, and that's how Kashmir factors into other issues and conflicts that are going around in the world. So I feel at this moment, it's kind of like the things that are happening all across the world. When we look at United States, there was a moment several years ago when people were checking into Standing Rock, and I'm sure most of us did that on Facebook. That moment for me was so telling. I felt like that this is the moment where someone, even with in the slowest internet connection, somewhere is checking into Standing Rock, showing the solidarity with these people. And personally, for me, these have been very revealing moments as well, not just seeing the collective power of this global conscience that was kind of tapping into Facebook, a very which is not the ideal platform, for lack of a better platform. It is there, and we all try to use it from time to time. So it was very heartening, but at the same time, I began to ask myself this question, like, I actually stepped into someone else's nightmare to look at my own struggle back home. And thinking about the indigenous people here, thinking about the people who have suffered for the last 500 years, thinking about the African American struggles, and thinking about the various nightmares that US is constituted of at the present moment as well. And then being a Kashmiri, coming to US and thinking about, being part of that knowledge base which creates these runnels to justice, being part of that, and thinking that this is going to be something in a few years where we can talk about Kashmir, but then looking at all of these struggles. So while you have those hopeful moments, you also have moments where you kind of do not know where exactly to start, or what exactly to do with this kind of realization. And this is also like, Palestine keeps coming up. When someone said, a friend of mine, that Kashmir is a Palestine no one talks about, but then I was also thinking about the indigenous people in the America, on the Turtle Island that no one really speaks about. So there's these layers of invisibilization that happen, and how do I connect with those struggles, and how do I lend myself to those struggles? And then this other layer, this other aspect. So there are people that are feminists from India who are actually on my news feed, and I'm seeing that these people from India, from South Asia, are connecting to Standing Rock. They are checking in. Then how do these feminists back in India connect to the Kashmiri struggle? You know, you asked about the essentialization of the gendered aspect of the struggle. How do they connect with the struggle? Many feminists in India would think about Palestine they lend their voice to Palestine. There is a sentiment and empathy for Palestine and Palestinian struggle, but do they lend the same empathy to the Kashmiri struggle? And for majority, I would say that it's completely non-existent. There's a lot of scholarship which kind of invisibilizes Kashmiri women's struggle and the kind of complementary and supplementary role that they have played. They lend to the argument that Kashmiri women are oppressed by their men. They lend to the arguments against the demonization of Kashmiri men. They lend to the arguments that make Kashmiri patriarchy seem significantly demonic, more than any other patriarchy, so to speak. And they kind of strengthen the argument and arguments for Indian occupation, which they do not see as an occupation. They more or less seem more patriots than the other people, even from their masculine counterparts when they're talking about Kashmir. That's the kind of narrative that happened in after August 5th, when India re-annexed Kashmir, when India militarily took away whatever was left of the autonomy that was given to the region. Again, it wasn't that consensual, but that's history. And that's another opening another Pandora's box. But thinking about Indian feminists, so to speak, and here I'm not talking about Mira. I'm not talking about that tribe of people that we know are allies, and I'm talking about people who actively stayed silent when Kashmir's autonomy unconstitutionally was taken away, according to India's constitution. But for Kashmiris, it didn't matter one way or the other, except the territorial sovereignty was gone. Now the path to settler colonialism for Indians had been paved. So that's the only thing that matters in the whole equation. But when Kashmiri women were used as a big pivot of removing that autonomy, that was something very significant for us, who had been for the longest time saying that women have been used not in the ideal of feminism, but as a potent weapon of feminism, that it was fashioned into a weapon. So one of the arguments that the Indian government gave for removing the autonomy was that the Kashmir's special status was a patriarchal kind of a setup where women were being disenfranchised if they were marrying non-Kashmiris. So there is a history to it, and we've all written against and tried to educate people that that was not the case. The case had been fought in a court, and it had already been won. There were some administrative things that could have been done. You didn't have to dismantle the entire state to get that gender discrimination done away with. But at the same time, what we saw was that while there was different ways that many people were talking about why in India, why the autonomy was removed, but none of them was saying that this was wrong. And when we think about gendered struggles, we don't only think about women, we also have to think about men. My primary work was for the last 15 years, where I was looking at human rights, but also as looking at enforced disappearances of Kashmiri men. So when you have men who are being disappeared rampantly, you don't only think about the women, you also think about the other side. So that's how it plays out in Kashmir, that when we think about Indian feminists who should be supporting Kashmiri women to gain the rights for right to self-determination, which should be a fundamental right, where their civil liberties, their human rights should be reestablished, but that's not being thought about, because at that time, the entire narrative that the Indian feminist bloc kind of gives is towards their own, towards the hold that India has over Kashmir. And then this again played out in media last year when Kashmir's autonomy was removed. Many politicians, and there was a lot of Twitterati was kind of going after Kashmiri women that now we can marry them there. And there was also this racist undertoning to it, where they were saying that these are fair women and we have to, we can go and marry them. And no one really came to Kashmiri women's rescue, so to speak. There was a politician who went on record to say to Indian men that now you can go to Kashmir and marry Kashmiri women because now the autonomy is gone. So you could kind of see the patriarchal, the conqueror's heart. You could see the imperial neo-colonial heart that India has, and you could see the silence. You could feel that palpable silence from the Indian feminist side, which was not lending to the narrative of doing away with this misogyny and trying to see this as an issue. But what they were doing at that moment by the silence and sometimes actively writing was kind of showing how misogynist and how patriarchal this occupation, this military industrial occupation is on Kashmir. And
Thank you, Ather. I'm sorry for interrupting you, but in interest of time, we will have to move forward. You're obviously speaking about extremely important issues. I'm hoping we can turn back to those during the Q&A. I'm pleased to turn to Mira, Mira, you're now situated in India, from where you work at the national scale with multiple communities of farmers, workers, trans communities, and others who seek justice through solidarity. We would like to learn a bit about the work of these solidarity movements that encompass various marginalities and that embrace myriad identities in the context of anti-displacement struggles and struggles for human rights and for economic, political, and cultural survival. Given that right-wing fascist regimes actively prevent solidarity building, how do you and your companions fight in an imposed system of fear that persecutes and prosecutes?
I'm actually daunted because 5 minutes is too short a time to kind of address some of these extremely critical political questions that we all encounter on an everyday basis. But yeah, I will try. It is true that as political activists and organizations, a lot of us, and I would say especially the present and the previous generation, has definitely made attempts to push boundaries and speak of issues that are not essentially about one particular community or identity or constituency that is being oppressed, but also to speak of oppressions within and to also speak of oppressions outside. But this has always been a challenge in terms of everyday work because one's own organizing around specific forms of oppression that any constituency faces is so overwhelming because the attacks are so many, right? From a corporate state, now also from this fascist state, from patriarchy, which is so overwhelming. So for instance, when you have to talk of women within farming, it's so difficult because at the one level you have to talk of farmers as a whole who are facing attacks in terms of displacement of their lands, in terms of corporatization of agriculture and all. But at the same time, you cannot not talk of women who perform 70% of various components of farm work but continue to remain invisibilized. You cannot not talk of landless Dalit communities who toil the most but continue to be denied land as basic resource, so on and so forth. So I think there is always this tension in terms of organizing as well, and within movements also. At one level, you have to talk of these quote unquote larger issues or the larger attacks, but at the same time, you cannot not talk of, or you cannot not organize around the not so larger, but actually the much more universal questions of oppression that communities within a lot of these constituencies face. And therein, I think there certainly is a relative degree of tension because I think for a lot of us also, and a lot of constituencies, there one is used to seeing oneself as into these binary categories of oppressor or oppressed. But I think somewhere it's important to also look at our politics and how we practice politics with a sense of proportionality. Often there is a sense of proportionality missing. And for half a minute, I just want to connect with my previous panelist, Ether, over here, when she, I think, absolutely rightly said that you cannot talk of patriarchy in such isolation that you only talk of individual atrocities on women, but you invisibilize occupation by a military state as by a military patriarchal state. So you cannot talk of one form of oppression and not talk of the others. And that has in fact often been, and a lot of us have been speaking about this, trying to persuade our fellow comrades about this as well, about how that would be a disservice to our own struggles and the causes we believe in. And herein I would again repeat and say that this is, I think, the value that we have to look at more with a lot more honesty and integrity, and not just the specific constituencies that we work about. Absolutely true that they are being oppressed on certain fronts, but I think it's also important to understand that there are micro oppressions within, and without actually invisibilizing the causes and the political dimensions of the larger oppression, it is important to also acknowledge these what might be referred to as micro oppressions, but communities that are facing multiple levels of marginalization, let us put it in that way, and engage in a politics that is proportional to the range of oppressions that people are facing, without giving any scope to the corporate fascist state to kind of invade our struggles or bring in differences within our communities. So that continues to remain a challenge with a lot of our movements as well. For instance, as a trans person from the trans community, a lot of times we do feel that, I mean, this continues to be one of the most marginalized communities, whether in India or in other colonies of countries like India, but be it in Kashmir, be it in the Naga region. But it's also, I think, true for the oppressed communities. Yes, this is a difficult challenge over here, but the challenge and the need to politically educate ourselves beyond our individual experiences or beyond the experiences of our constituency of oppression. Yes, it is not easy. Because a lot of times those who face these oppressions are so overwhelmed, but I think there is no shortcut to this, but and over here again the point of proportionality, that the greater the privilege of a certain oppressed community, the greater the responsibility to also engage with those who are more marginalized, the greater the responsibility to ensure that their agency is respected and their representation in many of these struggles is ensured. I was just thinking of recently we were having this conversation in a meeting with some fellow activists, and there was this whole question of, because the Indian state is now particularly, it has been happening always, but more so now criminalizing various forms of dissent, including what is referred to in the Indian parlance as Chakka Jam, which is road blockade basically. So when the Muslim women of Shaheen Bagh or Seelampur or other places did this in Delhi as part of the the opposing the oppressive citizenship law struggle, there that was criminalized. That act of peacefully blockading a road was criminalized. But at the same time, we saw just a couple of weeks back, thousands of farmers also who have been opposing oppressive ordinances and laws of this regime have also indulged in a roadblock. Now the question is, will we be able to get our farmers, and then at least until now, thankfully, there has been no criminalization of this particular form of roadblock. And we absolutely believe that all forms of roadblock are peaceful, democratic forms of expression. But the challenge is whether the farming community, for instance, would be in a position to speak up against or speak up in solidarity with those who were with the Muslim women who were part of the citizenship protest, and say it in unambiguous terms that yes, we have the right, when our right to roadblock is, we've been able to do it. So do our sisters who were part of who valiantly led the citizenship struggle have the right to do it. The state does not, the state cannot jail them under oppressive laws like the UAP, anti-terror laws. So I think there are these very real questions. How do you get the quote unquote broader constituencies of farmers and workers also to acknowledge that specific communities, because of their identity, because of their location, face further marginalization? And how do you, and I think this is something that Jay was also referring to, it's not as if many of us are, that there is a contestation around the violations that farmers and workers are facing. Of course, these categories are also not monolith, but how do you look at these and how do you build solidarities? And what is the language that I think we can deploy to convey this sense of and this need to actually look at how the state also tries to fracture our solidarities? I think these are some important questions that we need to look at. And just one thing, there is also this challenge of a lot of times, I mean, constituencies are set in boxes, what I was saying previously. So, so the state is not wanting you to stand up for others. And I think it is, in that context, our responsibility as political activists to kind of expose those strategies. And we see this happening literally under the current fascist regime. We see it happening with our transgender community. We see the kind of co-option that is happening in terms of passing certain laws or bringing in certain councils in the name of the interest of the community, whereas there is actually a sinister agenda to right-wing-ize a constituency which has hitherto been so marginalized and so ignored. So yeah, there are these tensions constantly. Yeah, so
I'm sorry to interrupt. Thank you so much. It's such important ideas that you're bringing, and I hope we can return to them. Yes, how power operates in such predictable and destructive ways. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to ask Susan. Susan, can you speak to the solidarities in the Southwest Asian and North African or the MENA region? As someone who's been arrested in the past for your activism and has had to leave Iran, could you speak about the double bind of fighting for women's rights while constantly confronting the opportunistic appropriations of women's movements by certain self-acclaimed feminists in the diaspora? In what ways can we build solidarities rather than dismiss the challenges that activists face in Iran, nor become complicit with the US interventions or the rescue missions by certain diasporic groups? How can we center the voices of women and activists working in Iran?
So thank you. I think Mira talked about solidarity being a value, and I just want to add a little bit to that. I agree that it is a value and should be a value that guides our work. And I've thought a lot about the impact that solidarity can have on local movements. And I think, first of all, we should look at solidarity as it's a mutual kind of solidarity. It's not something that we give to others or others just give to us. It needs to be mutual, it needs to be inclusive. And I think we talked a lot about that. But for me, at least in the Iranian context, and I think even broader in the broader Middle East context, that solidarity and recognition and support of work of people in those regions should really celebrate collective work. I think there is especially solidarity and support that comes from the West, particularly, is so focused on individuals that it undermines the collective work. And really in our context, we're working so hard against systems that are not necessarily participatory, that they're, where we've grown up in systems of dictatorships, and it's very difficult for us to advocate for more inclusive and participatory approaches. And then when individuals are celebrated at such extreme levels, it undermines that collective work. So I just wanted to sort of put that in there, because I think it's something that's just been weighing on me, and I've been thinking about it a lot, especially in the last couple of days, that, supporting that collective action is really important. But in the case of Iran, the discussion on Iran is so incredibly polarized. On one end is the sort of the narrative that's provided by the state that, that's, you know, it's a very you know, it justifies repression, it justifies, you know, limiting civil society, limiting dissent, or crushing dissent, etc. And, you know, it gives its own version. And I don't have as much of a problem with that, because I think there are multiple narratives that challenge that from within the country and from outside at multiple levels. So I'm not going to go so much into that. But the other extreme is a narrative that's emerged, especially in the last few years, with, you know, the election of Donald Trump and the emboldening of these groups that are opposed to the Islamic Republic, but also feel that with Donald Trump and these extreme right-wing people in office, that they're finally going to have an opportunity to, with the support of the US, to have regime change and have military intervention, basically. I mean, people don't, because military intervention is so despised by the Iranian public, they don't ever come out and say it, but they do talk about regime change without ever giving any explanation of how that's going to happen. One way that it is kind of happening right now, and one of the strategies that the Trump administration has adopted, is through basically dismantling Iran's economic system through imposition of unilateral sanctions that are destroying the fabric of not only Iran's economy, but Iran's, you know, fabric of Iran's society. Of course, I'm not going to say that the Iranian government and the Iranian state is not to blame. They're also to blame for this, but this rapid decline is very much tied to these unilateral sanctions. And, you know, centered to this discussion is also this notion of saving the Iranian people from this, you know, this cruel state, and especially saving the Iranian women, similar to the discussions of Kashmir that, you know, that was discussed earlier. That whole, and we saw a lot of this, I think, with the invasion of Iraq. We saw a lot of it with the sort of attack, the invasion of Afghanistan. So we saw a lot of this discourse, and this discourse has always been around with respect to Iran, but it's especially more so now. And so a lot of the issues that the Iranian women have worked on and advocated against, and, you know, with I think with intentionally having sort of a long-term vision in mind and strategies in mind, have now been co-opted by people who are based outside the country, who are very much in line with these right-wing agendas, and have along with them co-opted the Iranian women's movement's demands as a justification for sanctions, for military intervention. And it's problematic, as I said before, because the Iranian women's movement is so sidelined, it's so isolated, that their voices are never really heard in the international community, where these issues are debated, where decisions are being made for the Iranian people in the name of the Iranian women. So it's problematic. And I think one of the issues that's really emerged, and I think people are probably very aware of this, is the campaigns against mandatory hijab. Of course, this is an issue that Iranian women have fought. Iranian women, not so much the Iranian women's movement, just because it's so ideologically charged, and their strategy has been, if we sort of take this issue head on, then we're not going to be able to take other issues head on, and it's going to undermine the struggle that Iranian women themselves are having against this hijab. So it's been sort of co-opted in this sense, and I don't want to dismiss it completely, because it has brought attention to the issue of mandatory veiling, but I think much to the detriment of Iranian women and the position of Iranian citizens internationally, because it's been co-opted and it's been used to justify both sanctions and, you know, military intervention and this economic warfare that's going on, you know, presently against Iran. So I think in that sense, it's important to recognize that, first of all, who's asking for solidarity, that, you know, also recognize that, you know, giving solidarity or looking at the issues of a country or space where you're giving solidarity to, that the issues are going to be much more complex that they're being presented. So if it's very black and white, you have to really step back and question whether that is. And then really working, I think, to center the voices of people inside the country. I mean, I like to think that I'm part of this movement and I try to represent, or at least speak or check my positions with them. But I will be happily step back and give space to people inside the country who are willing and able to speak up, and they're not able to speak up because they're attacked both internally by a repressive government, and then externally by these groups of people who have co-opted the women's issues. So if you speak out against their agendas and their issues, you're immediately labeled as collaborators of a repressive regime that's a violator of human rights. So I think in that sense, it's important to think about ways where we can create safe spaces for people from inside the country, inside the women's movement, inside of other movements, to speak about their issues and to really present those nuances. And we need to be careful and look for those nuances and know more complex messages. And just I know that my time is up. I'm just going to make this one quick comment that I think it's also really critical for Iranian women in the region also to have solidarities with their counterparts in the region. They've been excluded, and I just have to say that Iranian women it's difficult for them to even engage with one another. This is the level of repression that they're working under. But increasingly, I think this younger generation has become very aware of the struggles of people in the region. And I want to point to Palestine in particular, because there's been a sort of a negative feeling among Iranians with Palestine, because the issue has been taken up by the Iranian state so much, so there's been a rejection. But in recent years, people have started to really understand the importance of this struggle and connect with it, and especially among younger people. And they see their own liberation and their own emancipation very much tied to this, to the Palestinian liberation. So, when Israel, for example, targets Iran with messages saying, we support you, a lot of times Iranians on social media, these younger activists sort of say, no, you can't support us because look at what you're doing. So I see this growing interest and effort towards solidarity, and I hope that it's reciprocated, and I work towards it, that it's reciprocated also regionally towards the Iranians. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Susan. So important to hear your voice. We will turn to Noura. Noura, given your current work involving solidarity between the Black Lives Matter movement and the Palestinian resistance movement, can you discuss what transnational solidarity and relationality look like in this work? How does the Palestinian struggle also acknowledge and be responsible to its Black and Afro-Palestinian community? How can we envision the Black American and Palestinian solidarity in the US and transnationally while taking into consideration racial, ethnic, and gender discourses, for example, the politics of pinkwashing that shape particular movements at the local level?
Like everyone else, I'm getting an essay prompt. So I'll do what I'm going to do is first I want to respond to some of the things, just drawing on what the other speakers said, and then I'll jump into this. So and I'll keep it to time, which is I'll keep it to time. Just on the issue, some of the thematic overlaps that we're all facing, right? When we discuss patriarchy, when Arthur brings that up, and the way that it has been manipulated and weaponized in a way where now, for the sake of our protection and liberation, these massive state apparatuses are literally going to destroy our societies, right? Whether it's the US decimation of Iraq, the contamination of water in Afghanistan, or as has been pointed out in these other instances where, yes, we are struggling against patriarchy, but when it's weaponized in a way that, sanctions other forms of imperial violence, we are no more the better. We are no more the better. And that, I think that's true here in the domestic sphere as well. When we hear things like, in response, to statistics of, I think it was the Malcolm X Grassroots Project put out a report in 2016 highlighting that 313 Black people are killed a year by vigilante and state violence. The response to that is, and even not even by state reps, but by others. But what about Black on Black violence? How come you're not talking about that, right? So there's ways that our struggles are weaponized against us, not to move us forward, but in fact to solidify that. Similarly, a similar stream is the fascism, right? Militarized nationalism and nationalist movements, that righteous movements, or self-righteous, I should say, that also connect us all, whether it be the Trump administration, which is consolidating itself into a fascist movement very explicitly. Trump refused to condemn white supremacy and told an explicit, out and out white supremacist group, the Proud Boys, to stand by and stand down, right? And to go to polls, insinuating that they could go to polls to intimidate voters. I mean, but the same could be said about Modi's India, right? The same could be said about Israel. And in that case, for me, it would be Netanyahu or Gantz. The same can be said about Bolsonaro's Brazil. I mean, we're talking about, and different movements that have been defeated at the poll, whether recently it's been in Norway and in other elections where this hasn't been the case, right? So we are facing a worldwide rise of fascist movements that will makes it clear for us what our solidarity is up against, and that what transnationalism will need to look like. The other thing that, just on youth. So the other thing about up and coming youth who are taking the helm is that not only are they anxious to take the helm, but also as part of this moment of challenging power, they're deplatforming a lot of existing, right? A lot of existing organizations that receive funding and a lot of existing figureheads. And so how do we balance that energy where, it's in fact necessary to have that internal healthy critique and simultaneously, continue to sustain movements and also be collaborative. So in addition to the youth empowerment is the idea of there's actually youth resistance to the way things have been done. And I think that that's also clear across our movements. As to the question on, what about the ethics of Black Palestinian solidarity? I'm going to talk about the current moment, and I'll pose a question. So here's the big question. The big question that really implicates is, what about Black Palestinian solidarity when anti-Blackness is so rampant within Arab American communities and Arab society writ large, right? That poses an issue of, is this really, what does that solidarity look like? And so to that's actually a longstanding question. And to that, what I'll say is, this is an and, it's like a but and instead of a but instead, that we're doing both. And the other thing is that also within, saying it just in that way, one, we have a primary responsibility to combat anti-Blackness, okay? And it reflects a fracture and the heterogeneity of Palestinian and Arab societies, that we are actually aligned because of politics, not because of identity. The other is to point back and say, we all live in the heart of empire, which means that by our very positionality, we are complicit in imperial violence, and specifically US violence. And so that responsibility is also a two-way street. Saying nothing when we live here is also part of continuing that order, so that we can think of this as also, mutual responsibility. A lot of pushback that we've gotten from Black communities is, the Black struggle is much more noble than the Palestinian struggle because we've been nonviolent and never lobbed a rocket at anyone, right? So it's both ways, in the sense that it's not just a unilateral critique about what challenges we have internally. And then finally, about this current moment, what I'll say is, unlike the moment in 2014 during the simultaneous bombardment of Gaza and the occupation of Ferguson, in this moment in particular, there was a move within our Palestinian movement to pull back our community, to make them refrain from saying Palestinian lives matter too, to refrain from making the analogy of we have a George Floyd every day, right, of putting up images, right, or to, and truly, I want to say fa'lan, the Arabic, indeed, within days of George Floyd's, grotesque murder, there was the murder of Iyad al-Halla, a 32-year-old autistic young man in Jerusalem who was holding a toy and doesn't hear well, saw the soldiers as he was on the way with his aide to school, and was basically chased down and shot at point blank. And then we were told that none of the highly surveilled, Jerusalem is one of the most highly surveilled, hyper surveilled cities in the world, and that none of the cameras in Jerusalem were on to capture this murder. And then within, a month, my cousin was murdered at a checkpoint, and left to bleed out for over an hour. And there was no investigation. And we were just told that he was a terrorist, and his body continues to be withheld as a form of collective punishment. Right. So, in that moment, there's a deep ingrained desire amongst Palestinians. Make the analogy. People have to understand this is not a security issue. This is a racist issue. This is a humanistic issue. So make the analogy. And we had to refrain from doing that because unlike 2014, this was not our moment of parallel struggle. Right. This was about Palestinian solidarity with Black liberation and less about Black Palestinian solidarity. And those nuances are difficult. And it's not, a black and white equation, but it was this moment. It was the feel on the ground. It was those conversations that we had with allies. It wasn't decisions that we made as Palestinians. We were being in consultation, being told there was, and I think it's relational. That's precisely what we mean by relational. Thanks.
Thank you, Noura, for all of that. Thank you for synthesizing so much of the conversation up to now and for bringing in these nuanced ideas about Black and Palestinian solidarities. So many important ideas here today. I'm feeling very full and happily so. It's my pleasure to ask Selma now. Selma, your artistic, performative, and political work articulates the urgencies for continuities of liberation struggles in the Balkans, a region that suffers from interwoven political rigidities of a post-socialist, capitalistic, and militarization-oriented state, and those of the international actors, primarily EU, whose anti-immigrant, Islamophobic, and securitization politics kills, disappears, drowns, detains, and limits, as you say, people on the move. How does one protest the state and police violence when these are normalized and when solidarity is criminalized? What kinds of disruptions, fragmentations, and exhaustions does the solidarity struggle for freedom of movement represent?
Thank you for the question. So I'm just gonna give a short context. I wish to start by sharing what Trans-Balkan Solidarity was addressing recently in a campaign, Stop Finding Violence Now. So the acts of violence occurring daily in more or less all the current concentration camps, police stations, courtrooms, deportation centers, prisons, and border areas in Europe are not isolated or sporadic events, but are a part of a wide systematic practice that is tolerated and condoned by the nation state governments and the European Parliament. So they are funded by public funds. They are a stable source of profit for privately owned companies and shareholders. They are reinforcing the arms trade, the arms industry, and war economy. And they are direct degradation of the international humanitarian and human rights law, making the right to asylum for people inaccessible. So what's happening, what we see in the Balkans and across EU is dehumanization, deportations, extrajudicial punishments, kidnappings, and forced disappearances, imprisonment, enslavement, human trafficking, torture, rape, political repression, racial discrimination, and other human rights abuses that are experienced by people that reach to Europe as migrants and refugees. And they are a part of, as I already said, a widespread and systematic practice that is being enforced by governmental policies and is conducted by law enforcement agencies, police and military forces, private security services, criminal groups, vigilante groups, judicial systems, and other governmental bodies in Europe. So in other words, the European Union and its decision-making bodies with nation-state governments are accountable for funding those acts of systemic violence that amount to crimes against humanity. So how do one protest that? Not alone, right? And I guess by being present and resilient in the daily struggle, by organizing resistance across various communities, by learning from and with the people on the forefront of that violence, by learning from and being inspired by the power of the people that challenge all forms of oppression with their life, with their bare lives, by building and empowering local and transnational solidarity movements, by risking your own freedoms and rights. And I think this is something that, especially for the people who stand in solidarity with the people on the move, has to, in a way, put on the table. We all have to put this on the table. By overcoming accumulated personal and collective frustration when the battle with the states and with the capital appears fragmented and disrupted. So basically, when it is constructing, when it's constructing and reimagining, reinforcing always a new strategy, how to disrupt a struggle, a movement, how to disrupt and fragment our solidarity. And by trusting the process, this is what I, for myself personally, believe that is the most important thing, to trust the process, as I truly believe that the social change and liberation is possible. Maybe not in our lifetime, but it is possible. So I see a lot of cases, and maybe shortly I just want to wrap up with this, because I'm primarily an artist, of art and academia that is appropriating, right, the daily struggle of the people on the move that I'm in daily contact with. So their struggle somehow overnight becomes, a project, the new project, one more project, or becomes a dissertation, a new dissertation, and so on. And I'm gonna give you just a very maybe naive image of a recent a recent example that happened here in Croatia, actually in the city of Rijeka, that is European cultural capital for this year. So there is Refugees Will Come, an light installation by an Azerbaijan-born artist who lives and works in Paris, was set on a post-industrial building in Rijeka as a part of that European Cultural Capital project, right? And I see that as fully misleading, right? The truth is the refugees, people on the move are not coming. They are here and they're being killed, drowned, tortured, and imprisoned daily. So I'm also interested in my work and in work with other comrades to understand how art as a practice, how art as a practice is not accepting appropriation as a strategy for its own production, how is not accepting to co-opt the daily struggles of the people on the move, but wants to become and is becoming a tool in the hands of those who are on the way, who are in the movement, who are migrating, who are seeking refugehood, and ones that are standing in solidarity with them. So I think this is, I did wrap up this in less than 5 minutes. So yeah.
Thank you for doing that, Selma. I'm okay. We would welcome your response, as the last response is the second round of questions. As a social justice weaver, an activist, and an artist, can you speak to the obstacles you face when you work with struggles at a community level, especially in the work you do with Black mothers, and as you call it, the art of mothering? Also, how are our solidarities bound up across spaces and time? What is the work that we need to do in order to responsibly make transformative connections between struggles?
Well, thank everybody, the panelists and the organizers for this. This has been a rich conversation. It's been nurturing and it's been thought provoking. The answer to my questions, in working with mothers, we have always known and believed that we have our own wisdom and answers. We are capable of getting the impossible done with nothing, and we've proven that for more than 500 years in the United States. But in the outsider's eyes, Black women can't do anything right. Um, Firstly, we're not human. We're animals. Our bodies are openly targeted and accessible and disposable. Black mothers have high mortality rates. Surviving children are labeled as inferior and rapidly tracked to special education, to prisons, and to early graves. Black mothers can never do enough and can never do it right. Black mothers are exhausting ourselves doing it all and trying to live up to this Black super mommy syndrome, and it's killing us because it's a monster. But I know 100 women at least, personally up and close, who are unapologetically killing this monster. I knew women who are revolutionaries in everything they do. They have boots on the ground and they have boots up people's behinds. They're getting it done. They're feeding and housing people. They're moving women from unsafe places to safety. We're feeding elders, checking in on elders. We're medics. We're teachers. Um, we're doing wellness checks for each other. We're learning to rest. We're learning to eat properly. We're learning to grow food. We're distributing food. We are busy. We are engaging our rage in a whole lot of different levels, knowing that there's not one strategy, one size fits all. Um, Your Mama began as a response to women um, being tired, being exhausted. I was working in an ECFE classroom, teaching the curriculum of healthy child development to 20 women who were very diverse. There were at least 4 languages in this particular classroom, and we had 4 interpreters. And this particular subject was about uh, encouraging creativity in children. So I just threw all these art supplies on the table and said, these are things you can get from the Dollar Tree. And, we know our children are creative, but we want to encourage it. There's no art in school. There's no music in school. So let's do this at home. Let's keep this going. And after a while, I realized the mothers weren't even listening to me. They were busy making things with their hands and pom-poms and flowers and painting and really having a good time, and we're really talking to each other. And I basically said, what's going on? And they said, we like this. We don't get a chance to talk to each other. We don't get a chance to sit down and have conversations with people we don't know anything about. In fact, we're told to be scared of each other. So they said, yeah, we'd like to get together and do something like this. So that was the seed of Your Mama house, which I basically did out of my own pocket and found any spaces that I could to do to gather women for 2 hours without their children, do art making and have these rich conversations. And basically the mother would happen. This is the way my mother did it. This is the way my grandmother did it. Somebody would come in with a problem and crying or needed a resource. There was always somebody at the table that knew something or knew somebody to connect the women. So we really started realizing we know what we need to do. When we're no longer going to be silent about it, and we are going to take the street and take the spaces necessary to get the work done. We as women are yoked and shackled by the same issues of de-evaluation as human beings. All women are, and this is happening all over the planet, as this conversation that we're having today has proven. I wrote a play called Angry Black Woman and Well-Intentioned White Girl, and it was clear I couldn't write the white woman's story. So we had focus groups where we had white women in one group and Black women in another group, and said the 2 questions asked was, can we be allies? Black women were saying, no, oh, no, we can't do that. White women weren't sure. We said another question that we shared was, how do you participate in Minnesota Nice? I'm from California. I've lived in 7 countries. My family is from the South. I have never, ever dealt with Minnesota Nice. It is the most passive aggressive, insidious, invisible type thing that you just get sucker punched, don't even know what happened, and you think it's somehow, you internalize it, something's wrong with you or something that you did wrong. But when I started asking those questions, white women giggled and black women got exhausted. So we found out that we participate for different reasons. White women have all internalized stereotypes that we have been weaponized against us. So that also keeps us from being together. So in doing that, I did this play that wanted to share the good, bad, and the ugly. What do we do as women? How do we get along? How do we become that? And our common denominator is mothering. Is how we all mother. We all give birth as mothers. We all know what the pain feels like if we've had that experience. We know what our bodies went through if we had that experience. So those are very key points from starting off. There's this great interest in building this global solidarity, especially at this time, but we can all see the collapse. And I think that's what we have a global attention. We have eyes and ears all over the world looking at this, because we're all getting to the realization this is happening to all of us. And in that's where the education starts. But the struggle, or the where we stumble in the stride, or where I stumble in the stride, is, do I want to educate other people that don't look like me, who are just beginning to wake up and say, oh, there's something happening here? That's a struggle, and that's an energy drain. So my interest is just to focus on mothers, to keep them up and going, and keeping their babies fed, and keeping their house going, and building a cohesive community. The work that needs to be done, I'm going to give a grocery store analogy. Grocery stores work the devil out of others. It's designed for us to walk into the store and be there as long as we can, and spend as much money as we can, whether we have it or not. And so it's designed that everything we really essentially need is at the back of the store. So you have to go through all the kind of riffraff and all the kind of cutesy stuff and all the things you don't want to eat are at the front of it. It's also designed for your little shorty, your little babies, to work the heck out of you, because where their vision is all the sugary stuff, all the toys, and they're begging you the whole time. So mothers are feeling this pressure to answer the children who want something that they don't need, and educate them what they do need, and get the thing done with maybe little or no money. So I look at that as an analogy of what women go through at all the times. We're constantly in a grocery store trying to get what we need, and wading through what we don't want, and being manipulated and being navigated to do so. So what we need to do on a basic level, we need to recognize the art of mothering and value the work of mothers, invisible and visible labor. We need to create multiple new designs that sustain allyships, that build the capacity in individuals and collectivity. We need to decolonize our own internalized oppression about art and artistry. Our art is not crafts and fetishes. We need to create our own spaces and institutions that nurture and support living BIOPC artists. Most things in museums are by dead white men. We need to work on internalized oppression, our ageism, our abilityism, our sexism, our colorism, our classism, the things that make us stumble as we are in this stride. We need to continually use a lens of learning, unlearning, and relearning as we do this work. We need to dismantle practices where artists and creatives are servants to the whims of the high class or the aristocratics, who define and determine what is art, what is trendy or commercially successful. We need to encourage self-expression through all art disciplines and genres that include age, ability, and gender orientation. We need to provide opportunities to learn about work by local, national, and global BIOPC artists who are in this work. We need to support museums.
I'm okay. Excuse me. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. So much of what you're saying is resonating with me. I appreciate you so much, but in the interest of time, I think we'll need to move on. Okay. I appreciate that. Thank you. I know that Nora must be leaving us, so I think I'll ask Nora I should say we're going to skip the third round of questions. We were going to be asking about the politics of hope and hopelessness. and if you feel, if you as panelists feel empowered to speak to that in answering audience questions or weaving that in, feel free. But we will now turn to asking questions from the chat that have been thoughtfully put together for us. And I'll just ask Nora before you leave the first question, and thank you so much for being with us. So the question comes from an audience member. What are thoughts or insights on strategies that involve less peaceful practices to protest or within organizing?
So one is forms of resistance when we go beyond nonviolence resistance. The other is the violence within our, but is the thrust on the external?
I think take it as you like. It's not clear.
So yeah, I mean, this is first of all, I want to say thank you to everybody, and I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to stay on to listen to everybody else continue their comments. And quickly on the politics of hope and hopelessness, I definitely think they exist in duality, right? For all the hopelessness that we can conjure is equally, and we started with that, right? To think equally the amount of hope that we must have to sustain and to fight, and that passes just as we pass along trauma, we pass along that hope. So as a form of resistance, to clarify, okay, I got it. On the question of resistance, and this is always put to Palestinians because of the way that we've been framed, right? Like just yesterday, there was a protest right outside of Qalqilia, where 15 Palestinian young protesters were shot and wounded with rubber bullets by the Israeli army. That doesn't get any news, right? Or the fact that right now the Al-Aqsa Mosque remains inaccessible. So Palestinian Muslim worshipers are praying, like right now, are praying outside on the asphalt. That's part of nonviolent resistance, right? Like Palestinians are engaged in nonviolent resistance on a daily basis, and yet nobody covers that. Because then what you would have to cover is to make clear that these are people that are like every other people who are striving towards freedom, right? And you would have to flip the script to actually critique Israel in a way that, Israel has successfully, it's not by mistake, but by their own work and design to insulate themselves from critique and weaponize any kind of critique against them. This too, by the way, this duality of our dehumanization, the lack of focus on our nonviolent resistance, as well as, absolving of the state, I think can characterize all of us and our strivings on this call. So let me just start with that's kind of the condition we're in. So that's why when we take up arms or choose to use force in our resistance, that's when we get scolded and condemned. And, further, we were never civilized in the first place, which is why we were excluded from questions of the nation. And we've just affirmed our lack of civilization. And so now we have to be beat down, and that force is righteous. And this is liberal discourse, right? That force is righteous because even though it's bad to use violence, it's necessary when you need to put, troublemakers in their place, right? Like we support Black Lives Matter, but not the looting. So the way that I'll answer, just my opinion on this is I do believe that armed resistance is a legitimate form of struggle. And I do defend all people's right to use that. And it's a natural right, even though it's also legislated as international law, right? It is according to Article 1, subsection 4 of the Second Additional Protocol of 1977, that all peoples have the right to use force against racist regimes, colonial domination, and foreign occupation, right? This is something that we have as a matter of positive law, but also as a natural right. So then how do we then navigate how to use that law? One, any kind of use of force is going to come with certain obligations, like who are we targeting? And here I might be different than others, right? I don't think that the right to use force is unqualified. I do think that it should be sparing, that it should be limited to military targets, right? And military strategy, number one. So there are limits and responsibilities of when you use force. But the other thing, and I think the more important thing, the one that I think and have discussed very publicly, is what is to be gained by the use of force. And that has to be the question, right? In the case of Palestinians, even though we have seen that the use of force by Palestinian actors in the Gaza Strip has been the only thing that's yielded any kind of change on the debilitating siege and naval blockade, the truth is that even though they've achieved those outcomes, right, even the normalization deals right now have not even eased the blockade. It's crap, excuse me, but have eased the outcomes of the blockade, but not for long term. So, you know, one has to, you know, there's more harm that we're inviting than positive. And that's not an absolute statement. You know, that's going to be a case-by-case statement of when it can be useful and necessary. But I have not seen it yield in a context today where there isn't global upheaval and there aren't national armed liberation movements all over the world where, you know, the use of force becomes anachronistic and manipulated in a way that causes more harm than positive to ease our domination. And that said, as a matter of principle, we retain that right as a natural right and a legal right, and I will defend it. So, thanks.
Thank you, Noura. Thank you for being with us. I know you have to go. This was a very important response, and when we were envisioning this webinar, we wanted to talk about armed struggle as well and legitimacy of it. I would like to maybe suggest that we go a few minutes over time, as there is only 4 minutes left to 12:30 Minneapolis time, or 7:30 p.m. Croatian time, or 10:30 p.m. Indian time and Kashmir time. But if we could continue talking a bit about the question of armed struggle, but also I would like to read a question that came from the audience. And I'd like to ask Jay, Susan, Mira, Selma, and Ather to maybe briefly respond to it. Several of you talked about the importance of political education in explicit relation to doing the work of solidarity and the challenges of doing this work in the face of the sinister agenda of the right-wing fascist regimes that are deliberately fracturing solidarities. Could you share an example of how you have been part of efforts to build solidarities across specific constituencies, or specific struggles or specific identities to form broader coalitions, and the political and pedagogical labor that this work has involved? And with this question, please take it as your final response, in a sense. We'll wrap up the webinar with that and thank our audience for being with us. Mira, would you like to start?
Can I come in a while? I'll stay back until the end, so I'll come in a while.
Sure, absolutely. Susan, Selma, Jay, Ather, whoever wants to take this and start us off.
I guess I could start. I think there's a lot to say as far as, you know, education and what that has to do with, I guess, the question of like onboarding for me. I think that actually education has a lot to do with armed struggle, I think, because I think that there are a lot of people in the movement right now, specifically white people, that think that armed struggle is just sort of like, you know, this like heroic thing that they can kind of do whenever they want with no regard to how that affects people around them. And I've said this a lot at some of the actions in Minneapolis of like, you know, I'm 100% for property destruction. I think that that's one of the only things that the state responds to. I'm 100% for injuring the cops in self-defense. Like, I think that that's absolutely called for. And like, I don't really care if the cops are hurt by that, because that's why they're showing up in riot gear to a bunch of like largely unarmed protesters. So, you know, I'm 100% on the side of using force. But I think that a lot of white people and a lot of men in this movement in particular, and cis people in this movement really don't understand what retaliation looks like for people who are not that, and don't understand, like, historically what someone who is transgender and gets arrested is facing versus like a cishet white man. And so, yeah, that's I can't really answer this question in a minute, but I think that education is also educating people about strategy and about like historical precedent and what has historically happened to people that engage in this behavior, so that they can be more thoughtful and more strategic about when they employ certain tactics.
Thank you. Arthur, Susan, Selma, Mira, the question of armed struggle or the question of political education?
Well, I
Please
think
be brief.
it could go either ways. I don't know how I'm going to, but there's something, what Noura said earlier, what Jay said, and I read this anecdote long back that there was a father and son duo traveling, and then there's a crash, someone crashes into the car, the father is wounded, and now they are in the corner trying to get help. So the kid is shouting, he's trying to shout outside the street. No one is really looking what happened. No one knows what transpired earlier. So the kid is shouting and trying to get help for his father, who's gravely injured. And then after a while, the kid starts lobbing stones because he wants someone to stop so that they can help the father. But now the people are talking about this violent kid. They do not know the history of the accident. The kid is not able to articulate properly what happened. And so suddenly everyone is talking about the violence of the child rather than thinking about what the entire situation is. I feel like in most cases, when we think about, we have subscribed to the violence of state as important. I think that's what we need to start thinking about when we are in these solidarities, and when we have to really make these long strides in order to understand other people's struggle. And when we think about peace, I feel like we really have to meditate on the word peace. Like, what is peace? When the government is trying to establish law and order, are they really trying to get peace back, or are they really trying to establish peace? So I feel that those are the things that we have to start talking about and unsettle all these terms and think about armed resistance as a resistance, so to speak, not as armed violence, because, you know, language and violence of languages, it goes long way to kind of even show solidarity and your own vantage. So thinking about Kashmiri struggle, I feel we do not go to the root cause of what is happening. Everyone wants to live in their homes peacefully. Everyone wants to have their mundane existence to carry on the way it is, and more so than the people who are inside this conflict and desperation. So I feel that that's something that we need to consider. And of course, you know, we have the international ICRC kind of talks about armed resistance and how it's the matter and right of people to do that. But at the same time, I feel like not just, I mean, law gives us a lot ideal of not law only as ideal of order, but also ideal of justice. Sometimes what peace looks like might be lobbing of a stone in order to get to that particular point. So that's where I stand on this.
Thank you, Ather. Would someone else like to jump in with a response? Selma, maybe, Susan? Yeah.
I mean, it's very, such a complex topic. I mean, to discuss armed struggle as a tactic in a minute. It's yeah, but I mean, for me, it's a legit tactic, sure, and of course, it needs to be organized and understood from the point of view of self-ownership of such, right? I'm more interested personally in understanding and addressing the violence of the state, the violence of the institutions of the oppressor. And of course, that includes education as one of, or schools, one of those institutions, that is preparing us for life by employing education for domestication. And there is where the political grassroots or education from below has to come in. And just very much in situ devise the language, devise the strategies and tactics, armed struggle being one of it, to prepare us in counteracting the violence of the state, of the economic regime, of whatever we are, put against in our daily lives. So I would say, self-ownership in that sense for me is crucial as well, to understand what does it mean for me personally, how can I practice it, and how is that related to the institutions of the oppressor that are setting the laws, the rules, the policies, are interpreting the struggles that we use in the strategies that we use in our daily struggles, but also in the movement as such.
Thank you, Selma. Would someone, it looks like Mmoke has maybe left us as well. So Susan or Mira, would you like to jump in?
Go ahead, Mira, do you want to, or doesn't matter.
Either way, yeah, you can do, and then
So I'm not going to talk about armed struggle because people have talked very eloquently about that, and it's just such a complicated issue to address in 1 minute. But in terms of solidarities, I think it's important to recognize that change and if you're looking to educate populations, that change happens over a long period of time. So this kind of knowledge sharing has to be sustained and over a span of time, perhaps generations. I think I talked a little bit about how that change has happened in the Iranian context, whereas perhaps the previous generations didn't really saw sort of Palestine from the lens of the state, and in their opposition to the state or their criticism of the state couldn't necessarily associate with Palestine, but over a period of time they've learned, and they've sort of that knowledge base has increased, and they have chosen, because of the new knowledge, to sort of express their solidarity with Palestinians. And in my own work, I think, especially in the region, what's been most successful is through convenings, is pulling people together so that when they're talking about specific issues or even broader issues, that they have faces and names and people to connect with. So it in a sense, it humanizes issues that might not be humanized for us, that we can really think about these issues that we don't relate to and put a human struggle and human face to it, and connect with that on that human level to issues that perhaps we are not supportive of, or we're not knowledgeable about. I think that the opportunities for bringing people together are key and critical. I don't know about building, a lot of my work has also been about building solidarities and knowledge between North and South. And, I have to say that I'm not in a very hopeful position when I talk about that. I'm not sure if that's that with everything that's happening, especially, this sort of move towards fascism, this what's happening in Europe with respect to refugees. I don't feel that this ultra conservatism that everybody is moving towards, I'm not sure if we've been successful. I'd like to think that we've been successful, but I'm not very hopeful about that. But I think within the South-South exchanges and opportunities for people to come together, they have actually worked very well in creating solidarities and understanding and building knowledge bases and support. So that's one experience that I've had, and I'll stop there.
Yeah, so quickly, I think I'll try and take both the questions, but very, very briefly on the question of armed struggle. Yes, it is a very complex one. We've all been encountering in our contexts as well. And I think most liberation struggles or armed struggles happen by people who are literally pushed to a corner for a long period of time. And it is in that context that they actually rise up and move towards an armed option or struggle. So for a lot of other movements as well to judge armed struggle from a very linear or singular perspective, I think is deeply questionable, and that inward thinking also has to happen within a lot of other movements as well that look at armed struggles in singular ways and do not look at the larger oppressive context within which they actually emanate from. Having said that, I think it's also important to look at the challenges that armed struggles within themselves also face, the questions of internal democracy within that emerge from within the movement as well. And I think it is a lot of time there has also been experiences of many of these questions being not necessarily addressed. So yeah, there are these continuing tensions, and it is important to talk of that as well, even as we resist the larger oppressor. And on the other question, yeah, I mean, it's a much longer conversation, but I mean, many of us, I think over here have been part of broader political processes and organizations that believe in this form of solidarity, because constantly, I think we also, there is this culture of wallowing in our own pain or our own issue, which is of course very, very important, no denial of that. But to be able to relate to the pain of others, to be able to connect to the rage of others, and to be able to, I mean, reach out with a sense of love and empathy to other struggles, and not just as a sense of, as an emotional connect, but with political sharpness and clarity is I think extremely crucial. And as part of political organizations that many of us work, that forms the everyday function of our work. And I think that is extremely important. It's not about one particular instance or event. There are lots of, I think this question asks specific events. There are lots of such examples, but I think it must be done over and over and again. As Susan rightly says, it is long term. It has to be done in a consistent and sustainable way to be. And we do, yes, there is a larger context of, I mean, how much of hope we have in today's times is a very real question. But I think more than hopelessness, yes, there is oppression, but I probably wouldn't say there is entirely hopelessness. Yes, there are dark moments that we are going through, but I think there is also a lot of pushback to oppression in different ways. There are newer forms of political organizing and newer forms of political education that we have been seeing, and especially with our generation, I must say, it continues to inspire, because yeah, I mean, people at the front lines, people who are most marginalized, and these are not few numbers, these are in millions. So when these constituencies in millions are actually fighting at the front lines, I really don't think there is, I mean, we have reached that time of hopelessness. Yes, there are grim moments, but we will push back.
Mira, thank you. Deeply thank you. And this has been such a breakthrough, and also in regard to the time boundary. We are going to come to a close of our event for today, and I would like to thank to all the speakers for your heartfelt and salient contributions that speak to the power and delicacy of various struggles we are connected in, and each of you is immersed in. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you to my co-moderator Lana Barkawi for wonderful co-moderation. Thanks to all the co-hosts and sponsors on behalf of the ITSRC. Huge thank you to all of you who attended and who have been supporting our work. And we'll close with the words, "A luta continua." Struggles continue. Goodbye.